Here at Baja Kits, we just rolled in a 2021 Ford Bronco, and we're going to be installing our chase kit on it. This is our chase kit. So what we have included in the kit: front shocks, we have resi mounts, all the hardware to go with it, rear shocks, as well as resi mounts and all the hardware to go with it. We have our Baja Kits upper control arms that fix the alignment when you lift a vehicle like this, and then our rear links that help it articulate in the rear end. So today we're going to be showing you an in-depth video of how to install all these parts, all the tools, everything included, tips and tricks. So let's get into it. So before jumping into this build, a critical point on this kit, on the upper control arm bolts, is you're going to want to loosen the pivot bolts before you loosen it from the actual upright. This is to keep it from swinging up. These bushings are under tension, so if you don't loosen them, the arm will flick up and potentially hit you or take out other key components on the suspension. You will need to cut the rear link bolt or drop the tank in order to get the rear trailing arm out. If you're doing upper link and lower link, you have to drop the tank, so no cutting of bolts needed. Before we go on to showing you all the tools, a lot of these tools can be subbed out for sockets and ratchets and longer wrenches, different configurations, but this will give you a good idea of what you're going to need to use to install this kit. The most important tool right here, your torque wrench. You're definitely going to want to make sure your bolts are torqued to spec. Super important that you have a torque wrench. Then we're going to go on our 3/8 ratchet. You can also do a 1/2 inch ratchet depending on what drive sockets you have. For our sockets, you need a 10 mil socket, a 1/2 inch thin wall 12-point socket, and then we have our 14, 15, we have our 19, of course, 19 mil in our 1/2 inch drive, 21 and 24 in both drives. Not saying that you need both drives, but it is handy when you have a larger ratchet. For the rear shock bolt, you're going to need an 1/16 socket, and then your axle nut, you're going to need a 36 millimeter socket. For our wrenches, we're using a 21, an 18, and a 15. These are our long style wrenches. They just help breaking stuff loose and tightening stuff, making sure stuff is actually tight. For our shorter wrenches, we have our 24 mil for our lower pivot bolts on our control arms. We have a 19 and 3/4 because our kit is mostly standard and King sends out standard bolts. But the Bronco behind us is actually metric bolts, mostly metric bolts. So we have our 15 and 14, our 9/16, and our 1/2 inch wrench. Moving on to like resi stuff and resi mounts, you're going to be using an 1/8 inch Allen socket, a 3/16, and a 5/32. Right here I have a punch, and that'll go with our hammers. I have both a brass hammer to keep us from damaging parts, and then I have a regular hammer to go with this punch. I also have a flathead, very universal. This guy, our razor blade, we're just gonna trim up our fender liners real quick. So just a razor blade. This goes without saying, power tools help out in a lot of situations. The one power tool you will need is a Sawzall. We use these to cut the bolts so you don't have to drop the fuel tank when doing the links. You can also use a larger disc on an angle grinder, but we just use our Sawzall, and it makes it super easy and fast to cut that bolt off. All right, so first step we're gonna do is we're gonna actually remove the bolt on the brake line right here. It's a 10 millimeter bolt holding it to the actual upright. Just gonna remove that so that way when we drop the spindle, it doesn't stress the brake lines and the ABS line. Next step was we're gonna take off this axle nut. It's a 36 millimeter. Remove that, and then we're actually gonna pound this axle back inside. So we got our punch, and we're just gonna put it in this indent so we don't damage the threads. If you hammer this axle, it will mushroom the actual threads, and you won't be able to get your axle nut back on. So now that we hammered this in and it's unstuck and you can move this axle, you can also look on the backside and see a gap between the axle and the upright. Once this axle is freed up from these splines, then you can continue removing a couple things before you actually remove the shock and the upper control arm. So now that the axle's freed up, we can go ahead and move on to the tie rod and the sway bar. Tie rod and the sway bar are both going to be 21 millimeter sockets, so you can just put an impact on them, take them out real quick. With the sway bar and the tie rod actually removed now, you can go over to the sway bar and actually give it a tap on the upright ear, just right here. Make sure that you don't damage the boot or the threads. With our tie rod out of the way, we can actually start to get onto the upper control arm, and we're gonna start off with a 24 mil and a 21 mil wrench and just loosen up these pivot bolts. Now that your upper control arm pivot bolts are now loose, you can actually go ahead and go to this 19 millimeter ball joint bolt, remove it, and it actually won't swing up. So when it's tightened on, these bushings are actually under tension. So when you take this off, the upper control arm is going to want to swing up. And just like the tie rod, we're going to go ahead and tap this part of the upright, make sure again not to damage the bushing or the boot on the ball joint or the threads. So with our upper control arm now loose and it off of the upright, we can actually just push this upright to the side so it's not causing any stress on the brake line or the ABS line, and we can continue to get this upper control arm off. A crucial step on the driver's side is you're actually going to have to remove a 10 millimeter bolt on the steering shaft and pull it down off the shaft. Ensure that your steering wheel does not turn, nor does the tie rods while doing this or while the steering shaft is off, to ensure that your wheel is straight when you put it all back together. With that 10 millimeter bolt removed, now we can actually take the upper shaft and push it up and slide it back up, and the steering shaft should fall right off, and you can just push it to the side. Now with our steering shaft out of the way, we can go ahead and get back on these pivot bolts and we can completely remove them. Now with everything removed, before we can get on to actually unbolting the shock, we're just going to go down to our lower control arm pivot mounts, and we're going to get a 24 millimeter socket and just give them a loosen so that the bushings aren't pinched and the lower control arm can move freely. With our pivot bolts now loose, we can actually put a jack underneath the lower control arm just to support it from falling. And now we can get to the actual shock bolts. Just going to be a 15 millimeter. You can use a wrench or a socket, whatever you choose. With the three 15 millimeters removed off the top and our jack underneath the shock, we can actually go ahead and go to the underside of the lower control arm and just put our 18 millimeter socket on it. We're using an impact for a quicker removal. Now that the shock is completely unbolted, we can start to lower our jack until we can actually pull the shock out. You're going to be very careful. You're going to push down on the lower control arm, and you're also going to keep this from flinging out. It's under stress right now, so when you push that lower control arm and it gets past the studs in the shock, on the shock bucket, that coilover is going to want to come up and punch you. So you're going to put a hand on it and just make sure to keep your face away from it. All right, and just like that, pops right out. We got our coilover here, and we're just going to slide this up. We're going to grab our nut and then slide this up through the shock bucket, put two nuts on there just to hold it so then we can get the rest of the hardware in. Now with our coilover suspended there, we're actually going to grab our jack again, and we're just going to push the upper control arm back up so that there's no gap in between this shock. Like I said, when going over the tools, flathead, super helpful. We're just going to go down to these lower shock mounts, and we're going to give them a clock so that they're flat on the lower control arm. And just like that, we can slide our lower bolts in. So with these King shocks, they actually come with these reducers that'll go on the bolts. So we'll go from bolt from the bottom to up, and then we're going to screw a nut and washer on top of this. Now that the shock is in there, all the bolts are on hand tight, we can go ahead and tighten everything up. So for the lower bolts, they're actually going to be a 19 mil. You can use a wrench and a ratchet and socket, or impact, whatever you choose to use. And then our three upper shock bolts are going to be a 9/16. At this point, you can fold your upright back up into position and start putting your tie rod and your sway bar back in. And we're just gonna put this on hand tight for right now, and we'll tighten it up later. Before you put in your upper control arm, you're actually going to wanna take your factory bolt and slide it through and line up both pivots. Because if this is in the car and you go to slide this bolt in there and it's not lining up, you're gonna have a hell of a time inside the car than doing it on the bench before you put it in. So we're just gonna turn these until they line up. Once they're in there nice, what we can do is we can take this bolt back out, keep that outside misalign on there, remove the other misalign, and we can throw this back up in the car. Put this in without moving those pivots that we just lined up. Now we can grab our factory bolt with our outside misalign on. With that pivot bolt in, we're actually going to take our washer and that misalign that you took off, and we're going to just slide the misalign over the bolt and press it into our rod end, and then now we can thread this on. So what we're doing here is we're actually just removing this dust shield cap. You're going to use an 1/8 inch Allen to remove these screws. So this top cap is actually held in with an O-ring and it's greased. So now that that's removed, we can access our 1/2 inch 12-point bolt. Now that we have our top cap off and our nut removed, we're just gonna take the upright and we're gonna have to finagle this guy in. You may need to play with it, but should slide together. So now that our taper is actually slid into our upright, it's just finger tight. We can actually go ahead and tighten our pivot bolts back up. You definitely wanna wait till the taper is on the upright, or else there's gonna be a lot of tension on this upper control arm trying to slide it down into the upright. Once our pivot bolts are tight, we can move on to the taper. We're gonna be using our 1/2 inch 12-point socket just to go into here. And then this is where we actually take our torque wrench, because this taper bolt, it's very important that it is tight and it is torqued. We torque these to 110 foot-pounds. So from there, we can go ahead and put our top dust shield back on. It's gonna pop in with the O-ring, and then you're gonna use your 4 1/8 inch Allen head bolts. Actually, on these top cap dust shield bolts, you're not gonna wanna run them too tight. Just barely snug them up. Trust me, they'll stay in there, and you won't have to deal with trying to extract them out. Now we're gonna reconnect our steering shaft. This steering shaft is actually keyed and it's square, so it's gonna be really hard to mess it up. You just gotta make sure that you don't spin it completely, because then your steering wheel is gonna be off 180. With the steering shaft slid on, line up that hole and put that 10mm bolt back in. Now that we have our cross-member resi mount, we're just going to put our actual clamp and connect it up to the bracket. With these 5/32 Allens, you're just gonna snug them up on there. Don't have to be super tight. At this point, we're ready to put our resi mount on, but just for ease of install, we're actually going to slide this bracket over our resi, and then we're gonna take the two provided 19mm and install them into the cross member right here. Once our bracket is actually bolted up to the frame or the cross member, we're actually just gonna rotate this resi until we're happy with it and throw our 3/16 Allen bolt in and clamp that resi down. Now that our coilovers and our uppers are in and bolted in tight, we can go ahead and finish tightening everything up. We're gonna have to put the axle nut on, tighten up the tie rod, tighten up the sway bar, put our 10mm bolt back in the upright, and then make sure you do not forget to tighten your 24mm pivot bolts on your lower control arm. To add a quick little note about the sway bar, some of you may experience some problems getting it actually in the lower control arm. Like say if you pulled it to the side and you bolted everything up, and now there's too much stress or tension on it, so now you can't fit it in the lower control arm. Don't even worry about it. What you're gonna do is just leave it loose, and then when you go onto the other side and you unbolt the other side of the sway bar, you can actually tilt that sway bar up and down. You may need a friend to help you out, line them both up, but once they're both unbolted, you can flip the sway bar up line up the holes, and then pull them both back down into the arm. While suspension cycles, our upper control arm is actually gonna touch on the inner fender well right here. So we're just gonna take our razor blade, we're gonna give it a trim just so it doesn't scuff up our arm. All right, so now that we're all trimmed up, everything's tightened, we're gonna move on to the rear end. Our first step here, and it's optional, is to actually take out the fender liner. So we're just gonna go ahead and go around and remove these Phillips head clips and pull it down so we can gain access to the nuts on top of the shock. After the fender liner is out and we can get access to the shock bolts, before we pull them out, we're actually just gonna put a jack underneath the axle to support it before taking out any of the bolts. You're gonna grab your 15mm wrench and just go ahead and start taking these 3 bolts off. We can go down here to the lower shock mount, and luckily the nut actually has a wing on it, so you could just put it on the bolt side. It's an 1/16" socket and just impact it off. And we're just gonna pull this bolt, drop the coilover right out. Just how we took it out, we're gonna put it back in. We're gonna slide in the top studs, and then we're gonna line up the bolt on the axle housing and just slide the bolt right into the lower clevis. Now that the bolt is actually slid in, we can actually just put on that nut and just impact it back together. From there, we can actually put these 9/16 bolts or nuts back on the studs and tighten them down. Before we go ahead and tackle the resi mount, we're actually gonna put the fender liner back in. Just like the rear, we're going to actually put on these 5/32 Allen bolts and put the clamp for the resi onto the mount before we put it on the truck. Now that our fender liner is back in, we can actually mount our resi, and I have it, of course, the clamp bolted to the mount. We're just gonna remove this film and slide the clamp over the resi and put the mount on. Now we can put our other 14mm bolt in. With our mount now finger tight, we can get our wrench in there and tighten up the bolt. From there, we can actually put our 3/16 clamp bolt in and clamp this resi down. Now that we have our coilover in, we can go ahead and start putting our links in. Now we're just gonna get onto these 24mm nuts, and then on the back side, the bolt actually has a wing on it, so you don't need to put a wrench on the back side, and we're just gonna take this nut right off. We're gonna do the same thing for the 24mm nut on the axle housing as well. And again, that bolt has a wing on it, so you don't actually need to put a wrench on the other side. So now we're gonna take our brass hammer, and these bolts actually have an acorn on the end of them. Just make sure you don't hit your threads, but we're just gonna knock these bolts out. At this point, we would put the link in, but while we're on the topic of the actual pivot bolts, we're going to jump over to the passenger side and show you exactly the problem with the passenger side and how we solved it. Some manufacturers actually put the bolt in from the inside out. In this case, Ford did that too with the Bronco. Unfortunately, when you take this nut off, you can't actually slide the bolt completely out. So we've included in our kit a bolt to replace this, and the way that we fix it is we use our Sawzall mentioned in the tool list, and we just cut the end off of it and push that bolt through this side. With the provided bolt, you're going to slide it back through and put the nut on the back side. You may need to trim or take the heat shield off of the vehicle. There's actually a heat shield or a protection shield that you're gonna take off with a T25 low profile. If you don't happen to have a T25 available, what you can do is you can trim down that heat shield. Just ensure that you do not cut the gas tank. Now that we have our billet link here, you're gonna throw it up on here. Obviously, this is the driver's side. On the passenger side, the clearance is going to be on the other side. As you can see, we put our link up in there. We slid the bolts in, super nice and easy. Now, that doesn't happen all the time. If your coilover's in, usually it'll hold the axle in place. In the event that the axle shifts forward or backwards, what you can do is throw a ratchet strap on the rear end and ratchet strap it forward or backwards, whatever's needed to get those bolts in. To finish it all off, we have a set of 37-inch BF Goodrich KO2s going on. We have fuel wheels. We're just gonna throw these on. Keep in mind that some models may require trimming with the 37-inch tire. Nevertheless, we still fit a 37-inch tire with our chase kit. We got our big old 37s on. It's sitting on the ground, looks super good. Kings all the way around with our Baja Kits chase kit. So now it's time to drive it.